Good morning, everybody. My name is Anthony Regan. I'm in the Department of Pacific Affairs, along with Sinclair Dinnan, who's just walked in up there. We're two of the founders of the State Society and Governance in Melanesia project, which became DPA in 2016. Been ongoing for 30 years. This session is about big data on democracy in Papua New Guinea. In some ways it perhaps should be about the way in which the electoral system is being developed in ways that perhaps undermine democracy. That's my take on it, not theirs. The really important thing about this work to me is that between them, Nicole Haley, over here, Professor in the Department of Pacific Affairs and currently working as advisor on election reform in the PNG Department of Prime Minister and NEC, and Thiago Oppermann, together over a very long period, starting with Nicole in 2007 national election, and then under her leadership in the 2012 national election in Papua New Guinea, the 2017, and then from the 2022 election, which she led, Thiago has played an incredible role in developing the methodology which Nicole began with in 2007, which involved not just doing election observation on the day of the polling and the day of the counting, but training people from the areas of electorates, constituencies, who know the language, know the culture, training them to do observation over an extended period, and also over time administering surveys on what people had experienced in the election, and in the recent election studies, other current issues as well. The incredible thing about this methodology which they've developed is that it helps us to understand the real dynamics of elections in Papua New Guinea, which, as you know, are not driven by policy debates or by political party positions. They're driven by a huge array of factors that tend to be very localised and vary an immense amount across the country. From Bougainville in the east, which has elections that run pretty much in line with what's required by law, through to the west, where there's less and less obvious compliance with the law and development of quite new ways of, in many ways, manipulating the system. It's a tremendously significant development in methodology because it can be used to better understand not only elections, but a range of other issues in not just Papua New Guinea, but probably the other Melanesian countries with similarly great diversity, and probably in other parts of the world as well. And I think it's an important thing that the department, the university, and DFAT, which has largely funded these election studies, it would be a very great development if the importance, the significance of this methodology was better recognised. So that's my take on the session. I've mentioned Nicole and Thiago. The other two people on the panel are Margaret Eiler and Sarah Kende, both of them heavily involved in the Advancing PNG Women Leaders Network. And they've both been involved in the national election studies observation that Nicole and Thiago have been organising, and they've jointly conducted with the ANU DPA the most recent local level government elections last year, local level government and Motu Koita Assembly. So between them, these four people have been the ones actually making this new methodology work and developing it as they go. So I'm handing over to Thiago, who's going to introduce the two recent election studies, 2022 national election and the local government and MKA elections from late last year.
Thank you, Anthony. That's a great introduction. I'll start off by acknowledging that we are an unceded and uncompensated Ngunnawal Ngambri land. May they have victory. The presentation today is titled Big Data for Pacific Democracy, but really I'm going to just change that to Research for Democracy. Data and better handling the kind of large amounts of data that we collect in observations is a very important part of it. But I hope that it'll be clear as we talk today that ultimately it's people that make this type of operation work, and that's where the really important insights come from. The rough structure of what we're going to be doing here today is like this. I'm going to talk a little bit about the results of the 2022 observation and how we distilled that to carry out the 2025 observation in a way that has already produced results really like, we were able to do that very much faster. That's really the past and present of election observation work that we've done. And then I'm going to open it up for the panel for us to talk about the future. There are grave concerns right now about where Papua New Guinea's election system and democracy is heading to. There's elections next year, and I think many of us have many worries about that. I'll have to speak a little bit quickly to give my co-presenters time, so please forgive me for that. The ANU has been involved in election studies in PNG since it was the territory of Papua and New Guinea. So there's 62 years of research there. There's been these studies form an archive that catalog an entire history of an electoral system in great detail. It is an incredible resource for understanding where we are today. These studies initially really involved researchers who were often anthropologists studying the areas that they were at and producing a little kind of mini ethnography of that electorate. Over time, these studies included more and more Papua New Guinean scholars and scholars from Africa, from Asia, from many other places. But in 2007, Professor Haley brought in a methodology more aligned with the international election observation studies, which had boomed through the 1990s, and integrated that with a particular vision of how to carry out this sort of large-scale research in PNG. As Anthony mentioned, it works very closely with communities. Those standards, these international standards of election observation, they encapsulate values and norms that we consider fundamental to democracy. But PNG is different, and understanding how things work there require developing those methods in a particular way. And that's what has been done iteratively in each election, with feedback and participation by hundreds and hundreds of observers from across the country. My contribution to this is really, I think, ironically, because I'm a very messy person, my contribution is to sort of tidy it and present it in a way that I hopefully is easier to picture. That is what I'll just briefly sort of go through. Why do we want to study PNG elections at all? I'm just going to skip over this slide. I'm going to assume everybody is interested in this, except to say that there is a threat in PNG at the moment of a loss of institutional memory. This is why I emphasize the existence of this long archive of studies and our own study, more recent studies, because it's important to remember where things came from, lest we think that what is there now in something time before has always been like that. It isn't. There have been changes, and we can show that by our methods. The ultimate goal of our project is to democratize elections data and to put it at the service of people, to formulate the strongest possible tools best suited for understanding PNG, and then transfer these. And this is where a PNG, WLN, we have been able to form a partnership to do exactly that. What are these tools and why do we need them? So our report for 2022 was completed at the end of last year. It took a long time, but this is available online and gives you an exhaustive, perhaps exhausting, account of the election. And it needed time, and it needs to be long and difficult because PNG elections are extraordinarily complex. What happens in PNG is that although there are national rules for how the election works that are meant to be the same everywhere, they are in fact not followed. There is informal organization of the election. And because the informal organization varies from place to place in a clear geographic pattern, there is inequality in the ability of the system to assure the constitutionally guaranteed rights that Papua New Guineans have. As a result of, so how do we display that? Let me just what we did essentially is figure out a way to classify these informal polling processes and display them on a map. This allows us to show polling station level longitudinal change in conditions. It lets us map the differences in electoral conditions and identify trends. I'm going to skip to show. So that process of developing that methodology is essentially what took so long, is to do this, develop these tools. The next step is to make those tools easier to use, both for the researchers in the field and for us processing that data afterwards, and ultimately for you, the people interested in PNG elections. And that's where the 2025 LLG election studied by WLN comes in. For this one, we have figured out ways of doing that much more efficiently. For the LLG observation, we were able to reach with 166 observers to 6 provinces, 28 LLGs, 149 directly observed polling stations, and a total of 35 different polling stations. We got data for some in one fashion or another, all done by the incredible work of Sarah Kende, Margaret, and others at WLN. We used state-of-the-art forms to do that. The report for that is going to be launched next month. It's currently under review. Let me show you what one of the tools that we developed for 2022 looks like. So here is I guess, overly informative slide showing different kinds of what we call voting methods, ranging from orderly, normal polling in which people show up, they line up, and they get checked against an electoral roll, issue the paper, vote, go home. Then we have a roll call. People are called up instead of waiting. That's quite an important change. The voter loses initiative. In our third voting method, the roll is abandoned, so you have individual voting, but there is no voter identification. Then we have these voting methods that are much more disturbed, including what we call household or group voting, in which ballots are no longer issued to individuals. We have monopolized voting, in which there is a takeover of the polling station. And finally, collapsed. Collapsed is where there's a so-called box hijack, where the polling station essentially stops voting. We're able to plot this on a map, and we can see a very clear geographical distribution of it. It conforms to a lot of expectations about what elections would be like in Papua New Guinea. Here, the blue dots show the orderly voting. The green ones are the ones that use the roll, but the voter has to wait. Yellow squares is where there is no voter identification, and red, orange, and black are the much more severely disturbed. Obviously, these are highly concentrated in the highlands. This is what I call the first geography of inequality in PNG, but there's a second. When we zoom into the highlands, we find that there are areas in which there is relatively compliant, good polling happening, even in areas that are otherwise highly distressed. One question that we had, though, about this is, could this just be noise? Is it because our sampling is sparse and therefore we just got lucky about foreseeing the 5 good polling stations in Imbongo? Well, setting this, so that was a question in my mind as we sort of approached the 2025 LLG election. What we can do with this method is apply it to the previous observations and create like a movie. We started in 2012, and you can see that there is this distribution of polling methods in the highlands region only. You can see that the eastern end of the highlands is mostly yellow. The red one is starting to pop up with these black and red spots. 2017, the situation seems to start getting worse in Chimbu. And then in 2022, the difference between the east and the western highlands has largely disappeared, except for the presence of hijackings in the western side. Now we can put another frame to the movie. For 2025, thanks to the good work of WLN, we can see that, in fact, the situation has gotten even worse in the eastern end of the highlands. But if we notice this area up here, which we thought could have perhaps been some kind of glitch or noise in our data, well, we can confirm that around Imbongo, there has, in fact, been a reversal of the general trend in PNG, in the highlands, towards much worse voting. Yeah. Yalibupanja, yeah. The other areas visited by WLN include Milne Bay, which has extraordinarily good polling, comparable to East New Britain or Bougainville, and Central and the NCD, the MKA. Those areas we saw some improvements in polling organization, but as we can discuss later, there were some disturbing tendencies towards violence. So this matters because it is part of this isn't just a whole bunch of spots on a map. This is how polling works. The mechanism of political choice is different depending where you are, and we can track this through time. For the LLG election, we took these methods and pushed them further. One thing that we were curious about, for example, is whether this mechanical organization of polling that we've just seen, whether that's related to the actual community choice. There's a thing called block voting, where the whole community decides en masse to vote for a particular candidate. Can that happen without people taking over the polling station? Do people just go like in their houses and decide, oh, we're all going to mark that person? Well, it turns out that not really. Most of the time, block voting involves sabotaging and taking over the polling station. WLN was able to do something that I thought was risky but worth trying, to see if the voting method changes during the day, which we call dynamic voting method recording. And another aspect of this, so what we did there is that we tracked across 4 time slots how the polling station was organized. And essentially here, the blue ones are the ones that use the roll. The orange ones have individual voting but no roll, and everything else is in the black section. And what we can see here, hopefully, is that, in fact, there is a directionality to how this works. If you go to a polling station at 9 a.m. and see that people are doing a more or less legal voting process, the odds of that polling station still being legal when it closes are not really much better than a coin toss. The intermediate category, where there is individual voting but no roll, is unstable. Polling stations that transition to that either transition back or continue to decay further. This has got really critical implications for how you design an observation, okay? Because if it turns out that going there at 9 a.m. is going to tell you virtually nothing about how it ends, what do you do? Well, what you do is that you use post-election surveys of outcomes, PESOs. This is another innovation for the LLG observation. The idea here is that there are aspects of the election that are relatively difficult to forget. So you go to vote and there's a huge fight. You don't forget that. You go there is no polling. You don't forget that. So why not just go afterwards and collect that? That's a really good thing to do if that works, because we want to observe as many stations as possible, but we can't be everywhere. It's very expensive, particularly for community organizations doing election observations. Access to vehicles and concerns about security might be very important. So being able to do these surveys afterwards and from that infer what happened during polling is very important. So what we did here is that we went to these are the areas that we were observed. The circles are direct observations, and these extended PESO, post-election observations, are the crosses. And we can see that you can extend the range of the observation like that. Now, by design, the two sets of observations overlap. So there's 100 that are both observed on polling day and after. There is 49 that are only directly observed and 185 that are only observed through PESO. And what we find is that this largely matches. 83% of them agree on violence when we look at that set of 100 polling stations that were observed by both methods. 83% of the time, there's agreement on violence, 86% agreement on block votes, 95% agreement on the use of electoral ink or of indelible ink. The other aspect of this is that we could compare non-observed stations with ones that were observed, and we find that they're largely similar, which is good news for our method, but is not good news if you thought observers were going to be deterring people from doing offenses. It seems that the presence of the observer doesn't really change much. Caution here, though, is that this method is experimental, and we would like to sort of see if we can push this further and investigate this in greater detail. But this has never been done in PNG before, so it's at least a little data point we can start off from. There's lots of applications to this using a very small set, really a one-page form to describe a polling station that is able to extract that voting method information. Means that you can potentially do this by phone or using bots on WhatsApp. You can have a self-submitting form where the form is just given, say, at churches and NGOs. People fill it in, take a photo of it, and it turns into data for us. And it can both be used for augmenting high-quality direct observations, or it can be used to create like a broader sort of halo data set of additional observations. How were we able to do this quickly is another aspect of it. This is where the big data aspect of the project comes in, so-called big data, say medium-scale data. Essentially, one of the huge problems of producing a report like this is that a study like this generates in the order of 30,000 pages of forms, right? Someone has to enter that. It's a nightmare. It takes forever and it costs a fortune. What if we could just not do that? Using tablets or phones is not really a solution. Tablets are expensive, phones are finicky, and the forms are too complicated to fit on a phone anyway. So instead, we created these clear human and machine readable forms. Then you scan the form, and then our custom extraction model turns that photo into data. That's post-processed, and since we have a pretty good idea what we want to do with this, we have scripts already set up to spit out those diagrams that we've just seen. This is what the form looks like. It's a lot neater than what they used to be like, and I think they look a little bit like those entry cards that you sign. In fact, that was my inspiration for producing them. What you do is that you produce one of these, then you label them in a computer and you teach the model to read it. It takes about 15 labeled examples for the computer to be able to extract all those little boxes. It's relatively good at reading handwriting, but you need more to deal with bad photos. So what we do then is that we show it horrible photos of the forms. I got my son to fill them in and play with them. And once you train the computer once you torture the computer enough like this, it gets used to reading even like stuff that you and I wouldn't be able to read. So that's how you make it go much, much faster. This has a transcription cost in the order of cents per page. It's incredibly fast. It's a pain to train the computer, but once it's set up, it only takes hours to enter all those pages. If you have more than 150 forms, it makes sense to do this. Otherwise, you're going to be spending too much time training. It's extremely accurate, like it's more accurate than people for the marks, but not so great for handwriting. And there's still a few sort of teething problems with it. But the main takeaways of this is that the costs of automated data entry are falling. And the fantastic thing about this is using paper just fits into a workflow that we are used to, and it makes sense for communities. You can just photocopy more forms. You can't photocopy more tablets, right? So this places the ability to do large N research within reach of community organizations or PhD students, for that matter, or government. I'm going to sort of turn it over to PNG WLN to talk a little bit about their organization and how they came into this. But I think, as proud as I am of the sort of system that I came up with, the fact is that none of this works without people being able to organize themselves and do things well. And that is where WLN really excelled. So, thanks. Yeah.
You're going to call them up?
Thank you. Advancing PNG Women Leaders Network, or for short is APNG WLN. We're an NGO, and we are a women-led organization. We are more a secretariat. We have women members that have gone through global women in management training that's been sponsored by ExxonMobil, and usually they go to US or Jakarta. And when they return, as alumni, they become member to APNG WLN. We currently have about 70 members at the moment, and we're in 18 provinces in the country at the moment. So 70 women leaders with 70 plus organizations. And our aim primarily really is to be like the main bridge or the catalyst for these women leaders and their organizations, because a lot of organizations, they pop up as associations, but they are incomplete. So we become like the avenue where we're able to facilitate access for information or other stuff that they need. We have our value mainly people as the core, and making sure that there is trust and accountability. Our programs are mainly to do with the member support. That is very important to us, especially the organizational development, and also to do with other programs like the election support. Now, for the election support, we are driven by the women themselves. Because they are women leaders in the community, there's been a lot of our members who stood up for candidates in the LLG or the local level elections, or even for the national. And that drives us, because most of them get to the top 10 and they bow out. Now for us, why? So that's the gap that we wanted to understand. And we're thankful for ANU to utilize the methodology, and we were also thankful the Electoral Commission accredited us as a domestic observer. So we're using that since 2022. We use their methodology to be able to understand that through the election observation, and eventually that will help us to strategize on how we can help these women. So that's one of the programs. Other programs we do less than like 5,000 grant management for small groups through our women leaders. And the other program is establishing hubs. We've so far got 6 hubs established, and we're hoping to increase by this year and into the future, so we have more hubs in the country. Our plans going forward, because 2027 is a national elections year for Papua New Guinea, and so we would like to use this year as a target throughout the country for election awareness. And we'd like to support more of our women to be supported through grants to achieve their program aims. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I think, so what I would like now to do is maybe if we can have a talk about what were the sort of main lessons that we took out of the LLG election. Margaret, you observed in Milne Bay, and Milne Bay is a place where the ANU had not carried out an observation before, and I think our expectation was that it would be roughly in line with Central or maybe Oro, but we really saw quite good polling on the polling day, but that wasn't necessarily reflecting very good sort of engagement by the communities. Would you be able to speak a little bit about that?
Thank you. Milne Bay, majority or the majority part of Milne Bay is a matrilineal society, and we had 86 women stand in contest the elections. I can only confirm 4 women who were successful. It's been difficult to get the full results from the Electoral Commission right up to this date. And I don't really know why that is, Thiago. When the women contestants, the ones that we interviewed, had their reasons for contesting, and their families, they say they have the support, but when it came to the actual polling, what we observed is that the support wasn't there. A lot of feedback that we got was that they didn't have financial, the financial means to go out and do their campaigns, the logistics. A lot of voters also expected some kind of, payout before they could cast, vote for them. That's the main thing that, we observed. For the first time in Milne Bay, we saw, or I heard of, a plan to have a block vote in a family or clan, but then when they went to cast their votes, it didn't go to plan. So the person that the clan had nominated or would have liked to have had the support did not get in. So when they went back to their village, there was big discussions and disagreements. We didn't get your support, so our candidate didn't win. And the younger people said, well, that candidate is already older person. We need someone who is young, vibrant, who will listen to us, the younger generation. And also, in one of the awards, for the first time we experienced or we heard of a ward that we had planned to go into and observe, but we got intel not to go in there. And after the polling on that date and then the counting, as the officials left, they were shot at for the first time that we had heard of in Milne Bay, or that I had heard of, yeah. So whilst we say that we are a matrilineal society, and so women have ownership, first ownership of land and power over land, that belief, or that what should be is not happening. It's dying out. That's my observation. The decisions are still made by men and driven by who can you get something from, which candidate can give you something. That's what I saw. And that started, going back to 2007, I stood for the elections in Esala. And our campaign was, I would like to say, it was clean the whole time. And towards the end, let's say maybe 5 weeks towards the end of the campaign period, one of my lead teams said to me, "Oh, Margaret, you have to pay for something. You have to pay some money." And I said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "Well, you have to pay. If you want to get in, you have to pay." And I said, "Well, isn't that what we're standing up against?" And then after that, we lost, obviously. We came fifth, but I was happy with that campaign. What I saw with the women candidates this time as well, not well prepared, just across the board. Yeah. When I think back to my own experience, I was ill prepared. There is a whole lot of work that needs to be done for the women candidate before they even go out. And so you'll notice from my feedback is that we need that work to be done for the candidate who is running, for the voters, before the next general elections. Yeah, thank you.
I think one of the things that comes out really clearly in the interviews with candidates from Milne Bay and some of the post-election surveys, what I've noticed is that many of the men emphasize the matrilineal society. They say, we're the matrilineal, this is but then the women candidates, they have a very different take on it. They say, despite the fact that we are matrilineal, things are not working how we expect. I was just wondering, with WLN and many other civil society organizations have worked very hard to get women candidates to be more competitive, to engage more. One of the things that we found that I thought was really surprising is that the number of candidates, the percentage of candidates in PNG, the percentage of women candidates in PNG decreases the smaller the electorate is. It's the opposite of what I would have expected. If we look at provincial governors, there's about 6 to 8% women contesting those seats. In open electorates, in recent elections, is 5 to 6. The LLG presidencies is 2.6%. And in the wards, it's only 1.8. So something is going on there that is not what we would have expected, I think, because the closer you are to the community, it seems the less interested or able women are to contest that. Yeah.
You're right, Thiago, because after the 2007 elections, I attended a workshop in Cairns with Dr. Leslie. I think she was with ALP. And the message that came to us was that we had to be in the community. For example, I lived in Port Moresby, and whilst I did NGO work with organizations, it meant nothing to the people in the village. So So with the last elections, the LOG elections, I was expecting the same as well, that because the women lived in the communities and they did a lot of work, the communities knew them well enough to give them that support. But that did not happen. We found that the winner, there were 3 women in the presidential seat, and one of them did well, but she came 6th. And during the counting and immediately after that, we had heard of, big cook-ups and big gifts being given and all that sort of stuff. So the person who won just ran away with the figures. So what does a woman, what chance has she got, even though she's doing this work already there, based on the experience right up to date?
I think, so that's the situation in Milne Bay, right, which I think had the best organization of the election that we saw. It was, MKA was also considerably better than we had expected from the NCD national election, so that was quite another positive surprise. But I was wondering, in other areas, like in Jiwaka and in Southern Highlands, the efforts by women to contest, they ended up running against something else. That they might have done the campaigns quite effectively, but when polling day came, the situation was one that was very different. Sarah, maybe would you be able to comment on that?
Thank you. Jiwaka was an interesting one because we had, again, less number of women standing for the LLG elections of last year. And most of these women were the ones trained by another CSO, Voice for Change. And they were trained on ward development planning. So these women had the plans up and they were able to go campaigning through the entire LLG. So, yeah, LLG, which was also a benefit for the other wards as well. And for many, there was like news for an NGO group to have trained their women leaders, especially to develop community ward planning documents. And there was the expectation they might come home at least in the top 10 or 20, but yeah, like Margaret said, as soon as they went to the polls, the story was different.
I think one of the things that is quite striking is that one of the things that we were able to do is to look at block voting quite rigorously. We hadn't specifically looked at these block votes. I'll just fast forward here, and we can see the distribution of block votes. And Jiwaka province there, we can see that there are locations, the black dots is where there's a block vote. We observed that we saw about 89 of these total. 60 of them we were able to profile more carefully. And in none of these did the decision to make a block vote favor a woman candidate. So even if you campaign, you might do your ward plan, walk all over the electorate, how it is organized on the day is just completely antagonistic. It's just not a way that they're going to be able to get in there. I'm just going to sort of move to the next question and maybe throw it to Nicole. Looking at the LLG election, perhaps the Dei election as well, what do you see as the sort of signs heading into 2027?
Thanks, Thiago. So I have to say I was fortunate in my current role to be able to observe the MKA elections and also the Dei by-election. We did through IDEC, the Interdepartmental Election Committee, we did observations of both of those. Dei in particular, I think, was quite interesting because through the ANU observations that we've done for the last 4 elections, we've had teams in Western Highlands in each election, not necessarily in Dei. In 2007, we focused on Hagen Open only. But we have done observations in Dei since then, and we've done them more broadly across the Western Highlands. And I think Dei was really interesting because I'm sure everybody's aware about the video footage that came out and a couple of ballot boxes being excluded sort of after they'd initially been entered for scrutiny. And a lot of the commentary around that was the fact that, Passenbelongel, this is how they vote in the Western Highlands, this sort of block voting. But in fact, the data is showing us something very, very different, that this is a much more recent phenomena, even in the Western Highlands, even in Dei. So in 2007 and 2012, we saw, probably more than half of the polling stations where we had individual voting, some use of the roll, etc. In the Dei Open by-election, I got to 16 polling stations on the day, and then also did the PESO and another 16 polling stations on the day after polling. And on polling day, I didn't see a single vote legitimately cast at 16 polling stations. So what we've seen is quite a significant shift, and what we saw in Dei earlier this year was significantly worse than what we'd seen in 2022. So I think that sort of, in terms of the trends of what we're seeing this, sort of continued deterioration in the broader election environment, but much more wholesale capture of polling stations.
I think it's interesting, right? After this study, I went back through that archive, going back to 1964, with the question like, when did this start, right? When was there a point in PNG's history where the electoral roll was good and people were voting normally? And what I found is essentially that there has always been problems. Like even going back to 1964, the Australian colonial government employed the full resources of the what was called, I'm not going to even say what it's called, the administration, to compile the roll, and they couldn't do it. In the end, the roll didn't really work. And so these problems have been there for a long time. And the problems in the Highlands in particular have been there for a long time. There have been cases of polling stations being hijacked since at least 92. And these fights and monopolization going back further, but there's clearly been a spread of this, and the way that it works is more exclusive. I think one of the things that you found that you're talking about that I was really interested in is that difference between a polling station where they cut the vote between the candidates and the other way of doing it. Can you describe that?
Yeah. That was something that was really particularly interesting, and I think it's something that Thiago and I have had a lot of conversations about, both on polling day via sort of texting each other and since, and an area that I think we certainly want to further develop the methodology in. And that is around looking at where these block votes are happening to determine, and one of the ideas that we're playing with at the moment are inclusive cuts and exclusive cuts. And I saw this particularly at one of the polling places that I went to on polling day, and there was it was at a school, 2 separate polling stations set up there. They had their rolls, but this was an area where there was a lot of, in Hagen, and in Dei, a lot of settlers from other provinces. And so at these 2 polling stations, they had demarcated them locally, this sort of informal organisation that Thiago is talking about, as one polling station being for the Chimbu settlers and the other polling station being for Enga settlers. And anybody who was a landowner was precluded from voting there. And this was being very forcefully enforced, and landowners being chased away and told to go to the polling station, the next polling station up the road. And what was fascinating was, and this was a case where there wasn't a controlled takeover of the kind that we saw at some of the other polling stations. There was very, very long discussions amongst these two different groups of people at this polling station around how they were going to vote. And in the case of the Chimbu settlers, there was a massive group of people, you know, several hundred people in a big circle having a conversation. It got very heated and loud. Men and women were talking, but it was very much a discussion around how are we going to vote? How are we going to, and by this time the polling team's here, they're ready to go, but this conversation is still going on, so nobody's voting. And the discussion was very much around the fact that they were concerned that if they didn't vote for the right candidate, they would be chased away, chased off the land that they were living on. And so basically that polling station, that community decided that they would cut the vote and split it between several of the candidates that they thought were likely to win. And this was being discussed in terms of their safety. So let's share our votes amongst several candidates who we think have a good chance of winning. So we're hedging our bets in terms of who wins, and hopefully that there won't be sort of violence and retribution, and that they would be able to stay there peacefully. So that was quite interesting. It resulted in a block vote, in a sense, where the vote was split and cut between different candidates. The next polling station over, and quite literally, these polling stations were only about as far from here to the back of the room. Do you know what I mean? They're both on the same oval. This was a very different polling station. It was for the Engen settlers. There, everybody was told to sit on the ground, right? So we've got one polling station with this big crowd of people standing around talking. At the second polling station, everybody's been told to sit on the ground, and a few male leaders were talking at the people, telling them what was going to happen and how they were going to vote and who they were going to vote for and how the vote was going to be cut. Interestingly, some people then tried to speak up and actually make suggestions similar to what was happening at the Chimbu polling station, where they decided to split the vote. In the end, very forthrightly, one of the local leaders got up and said, "We are Engen, we eat from only one plate, and we will vote for this one candidate." And so that was the decision, and it was very much a decision that was imposed on the entire community, and they cast their vote. And so this, to my mind, and I saw this play out at several other polling stations through the day, where there were different discussions around sort of cutting the vote in particular ways that were around trying to ensure safety. Sometimes a polling station was being claimed by a local candidate as their base vote, and so that they, in a sense, had the right to cut the vote. But there was a sense in some communities, an expectation that the candidate would cut the other votes, that the preferences, in a way that would enhance the safety of the community moving forward. So it was quite an interesting dynamic, I think, in terms of the different ways that this is happening. And I think, certainly through our data at the moment, we can see block votes, but we can't necessarily see all of the I suppose what's gone on before or what's gone into that, and the the thinking and the decision making and who is making those decisions. And that's something that I think we need to, you know, try and find ways to be able to interrogate further.
Thanks, Nicole. That's a really interesting point. It makes me think back to Sir Trowan's report on the 2013 LLG election, which also had lots of problems. In that case, many LLGs were in fact failed, the writs were withdrawn for a whole range of reasons that read like science fiction today. For example, they removed the writs because they didn't use the ink properly. I mean, the idea of doing that in a current environment is far-fetched. But Sir Trowan does mention that something that is really interesting, that he says that sometimes they cut the vote like they're cutting a pig. Yes. And one person, but it's someone's pig to give away. Yes. And in other cases, they are making a deal to create a peace. I thought that that's also something that comes through, particularly with the Juaka observation for the LLG, where the community was essentially giving the ballot books to candidates in exchange for there not being a fight, right? Which I think raises a whole range of questions.
And it was something we saw, sorry. That was also something that came out in the 2022 observations in Pori. Our observers there witnessed this in a sense where on polling day, the candidates or candidate agents were actually handing out a large sum of money to the ward councillor on those occasions, and they were basically compensating communities for their polling place and for all their ballot papers. So a large payment was handed out. Basically, that was the agreement that nobody would vote. The ballot papers would be given over to the candidate in question to do as they wished with them, and then the councillor presided over sort of, you know, divvying up the money to the community.
Thanks. So I think the next sort of slide I have up is what can we do to prepare for 2027, and I wanted to throw it back to Sarah and Margaret. What we were just discussing about block votes, and in particular this issue of trying to create safety at the expense of a normal voting process. How do we engage with that? What kind of awareness? How do you view civil society engaging with the communities to try to improve things in the election space in PNG?
Thank you. In preparation for 2027, we see that we're just one NGO. To do a nationwide awareness, it is important that we work with other CSOs. So we do sit on as a, part of a steering committee on the CACC, or we call it the Coalition Against Corruption in PNG. And that's the body that we'll be using to work together to target throughout the country in terms of doing the election awareness. And we see that as very important, because doing it collectively and coordinating it in a way that we're not just doing awareness as if like in campaign type, but more inclusive of who are the power breakers in the communities, because young people are the main ones that we've seen, are the push behind in the communities of who they vote. So we are aiming to see how best we can engage the young people through like focus group or through workshops to help disseminate information about what is democratic election voting, and also hear from them. Because some of them are born into the society where they think it's normal to go through block voting and so forth. So we are currently in the process of planning, because as an organization we have a biannual AGM, and we're having that next week. where all our members come together and all these different CSOs come together and do a session on it, and we will strategize on how to do this.
Thanks, Thiago. I think, you know, one of the, I suppose one of the other things that we sort of talked about today is the way that the methodology that we've developed, obviously, is being used by civil society. We've also used that same methodology too now through IDEC as well, with the 2 observations that we've done. And so we're sort of, the methodology is being incorporated back into some of the work that the government is doing as well. And particularly around the forms and the PESO forms and different things that I've also been having, I've been having some discussions with the RPNGC as well around developing a short form as well, like PESO, for security personnel that were at polling stations on the day. This was something that we had seen in the past, you know, going back many elections, was that the police would, you know, security personnel at polling stations would file short reports on polling day. And those could be drawn on in the counting room as well as, you know, sort of, I suppose, independent advice as to how polling went at a polling station. Some of these procedures have fallen by the wayside over the years. But, you know, looking at how we can reinstitute some of those, but again, using the sort of technology and the forms and things that you've used so that we can actually collect this data really quickly and have that available to, you know, say the Electoral Commissioner, to returning officers and things in counting rooms, etc. So, you know, I think we're looking at different ways that we can, you know, sort of have the work that we've done inform both the work of government, the Electoral Commission, civil society and things. And so that's sort of something I suppose for me, when we first undertook this in 2007, the methodology we sort of designed in such a way that it was collecting 2 different types of information, like lots of information around electoral administration and the conduct of the election, but also the information that it really collects around sort of political culture and the changing nature of elections and those kind of things. And so now we're seeing, I think, the fruits of that being able to inform different streams of work across a whole different range of areas.
Thanks. I wanted to, just before I open up for questions, I was going to talk, I wanted to ask a question to my co-panelists about awareness. So in Pidgin, awareness sounds like, you know, it's like awareness raising session, but it's a word that has its own meaning. And to do an awareness, it often has a meaning to me that sounds a lot. I'm taking back to when the common, I think it was the BSP came to do an awareness about loans in the village I did my field work in. And this guy came in and just talked for like 20 minutes. And then this copra farmer asked, so can I get a loan? And the guy said, no. And then they left. And so that to me is sort of like a very ineffective form of awareness raising, right? It's more like the guy did his job, he did his awareness, and he left. It's clear that there has to be a lot of voter education in PNG. But how do we make awareness better? What is it, how do we engage with that? And I guess a follow-up to that is awareness enough? In some places, do we need to start further down about peace building and rebuilding relationships in the communities? I wonder if you had some comments about that.
what I have observed, awareness has become like a more campaign than awareness itself. But during the last observation, a lot of the voters, or a lot of people that I talked to came up to me and asked if we could go out and talk to the people well in advance of the next elections, not just 1 month or 2 months. So in my mind, I was thinking something would have started like in December, just gone, or January. And awareness, not just about the process or the LPV system, but awareness right across from what is leadership for the communities, the voter education, to cover all of that. What is leadership? When someone is putting their hand up to lead the community or to stand as a candidate, how does he see himself as a leader? What change is he really trying to make for the people? And the voters also to be educated on what do they want to see in a leader. And not just elect someone because he's a family member or he's given them 5 kina or 20 kina or 50 kina, whatever it is, or oli kai kai pigblon empinis or kai kai kakaruk. There has to be more. There has to be sitting down with the people in the communities and story, want them all, but done in a structured way where we're working through either the wards, where families sit down together, or they have in the communities, they have their community days, in the villages, community days. So dedicate days or make time available in their programs to sit down and have these conversations. What are they looking for in a leader? Who makes a good leader? What has that leader done for them? In this last observation, a few women and men that I talked to, the candidates, and their response when I asked them the question, what motivated you, or what is your, sem astintin lo you get up, you son up, or all their response is, all youth toki me lo son up, or all family toki me lo son up, which is my response before, without fully understanding, what was involved. So, Thiago, I think the idea of sitting down and talking with the people, and fully going through the whole electoral voting, the electoral system or the political system, so that they have, I think by now we should, or everyone should have an understanding of what is their democratic right, what does political, the elections, what does it mean for them, what changes do they want to see? Because in this observation as well, we had one village where there was no informal votes, and they got the person that they wanted, because they have one member in their community who is what they say in my language, togelu, meaning someone who works outside but comes home to the people and lives with the people. So she was able to educate her whole community, so they did not have one informal vote. And then you have other communities where they don't have anyone who is working outside. So, Olnogat Save. One whole community said, why should we vote? How many years now Mipla vote now? We don't see any improvement, we don't see any change. Another community said, Mipla plenty illiterate. So when we go to cast the vote, they ask somebody else to cast the vote for them, and it's not the person that they intended. So there's very big gaps there, lots of issues to be addressed. So I was thinking like a structured meaning By that I mean from understanding what leadership is right down to the common role even. You know, that's a big issue, yeah.
Also, just adding on, I mentioned about targeting youth. So our audience will not just be youths. We're also looking at the different players. That's the police, even the polling officials that come in and help support in the polling. So we're looking at, and also who helps us. We're also looking at that too. So we're hoping to, finalize that and carry that out before the REITs open next year. It's around June, right? April, June, yeah.
Thank you. I think they're very thoughtful comments, and I think it stressing the importance of really building up that engagement with democracy, like at the grassroots, to get that going. I do wonder whether in some places, and this is my personal feeling, I think, from reading too many of these reports, is to me it often seems that the communities are struggling with internal division. So there is inogat wampla tintinta so. And there's a huge value in PNG on unity, on one bell, right? And then when that turns out not to be the case, and it's very obvious on polling day, then people just don't seem to really know how, they don't have the capacities or framework for finding a peaceful resolution for that. Or maybe the peaceful resolution is a block vote, right? So this is, to me, that's something to, I wonder how we go about approaching that. To me, it sounds like it's something that has to be driven by communities. But I wanted to open it up for questions. Our chair.
You want me to handle that?
Yeah,
I'm not sure what the role of the chair is.
well, the chair, take notes maybe.
Okay. Questions, comments? Yes.
First, I just want to say that I really appreciate this. This was lovely, and I appreciate the subnational focus as well. I guess my question would be, how does the PNG government sort of do this itself? What do you sort of make of their infrastructure, democracy, or how there needs to be a change on that sort of national level rather than there may be subnational focus?
Yeah, so one of the things that, today we've talked about polling really, but the reports touch on a lot of other issues. A massive part of the work is to understand the, I guess, infrastructure of the election, and that includes the administrative infrastructure that should be there and often isn't. In the case of these, this is sub-national, so these are local level governments and wards. They are unfortunately in a quite bad place in terms of their, I guess, they're very poorly defined. So wards don't really, there's no real constraint on how large or small a ward can be. One slide that I had here, just waiting for a question like that, is this is all of PNG's, the top graph shows all of PNG's wards on a log scale in the number of voters. And it's a terrifying graph for me because the smallest ward has 3 voters and the largest one has 15,000, right? And all of these wards now receive the same service improvement program of 30,000 kina per year. Now you can just imagine what's going to happen. One thing about this graph, you notice that the right side is yellow. That's because those are the highlands wards. There's going to be pressure on these wards to split to access that money. That destabilizes the electoral roll. It destabilizes the electoral geography at a kind of molecular level. So that is very difficult. And having set up that horrific problem, I'll throw it to Nicole. How do you solve that, Nicole?
Yeah. Well, this is something we're definitely grappling with at the moment, both in terms of trying to understand the problem, but this, certainly over the last few years, we've seen a very significant increase in the creation of new LLGs and wards, and the new LLGs, as Thiago said, are very poorly defined. Many of them have blank descriptive schedules, so we don't actually know, how new wards relate to the old wards. And so this created a massive problem and headache leading up to the LLG elections, and certainly led to them being delayed while the Electoral Commission in particular tried to address this, what they called this sort of ward alignment issue. And that actually has two aspects to it. So one is in terms of aligning the wards to the right electorate, and then secondly, aligning people to the right ward. And there seems to be a really fundamental disconnect at the moment, and this is something that we're certainly trying to work through. The reality is that going back to 1964 and the first elections, PNG had very distinct administrative and political geographies all the way through. There was an alignment between open electorates and between administrative districts and sub-districts. The 1995 decentralisation reforms, following that we saw the enactment of the organic law on provincial governments and local level governments. And that represented a deliberate attempt to actually align PNG's political and administrative geography such that district boundaries were defined as the boundaries of the open electorates. The open electorates in 1997 were the same open electorates that had been approved by Parliament in 1977. The reality is that various government departments have never aligned behind that, and so they continue to work with notions of what districts are. This has been perpetuated as well through the census process, so that after LLGs, the first LLGs were proclaimed in 1997, and then in the 2000 census, they changed the way that citizens were recorded in the census, and then they were now recorded under LLGs and wards, which has had the effect so that in the 2000 census, the NSO developed what it called a special concept for census purposes, and that was this notion of an NSO statistical district, which was simply for recording and reporting census data. But these districts now, which were only a concept and which were statistical, are the boundaries that are being used in many places, which are not the same as the boundaries of the open electorates. And this has created a massive headache, and it's one that's obviously an ongoing challenge that we've got to find solutions for.
Just to complete, to add to that, the reason we answer your question like this is that if you can't make the role, then everything else is in danger. What we had found between elections is that polling stations that attempt to have individual voting without using the roll don't tend to stay that way. They tend to get worse. And WLN showed that this also happens within the polling day. So what that is showing us, and this destabilization of the geography, makes it much harder to create an electoral roll, which was already not easy. So in a situation where one pillar of the election is looking very wobbly, and then there are many, many other aspects that require attention. Any other questions?
At the back.
I think over here first, then Jill.
He had a question.
Can I just ask, I mean, I know all about this discombobulation issue, but looking forward to next year, have the methodological innovations you've made since 2022, especially last year, going to increase the number of electorates where you're going to be able to make observations next year? So will you be able to include, say, Milne Bay, Gulf, Western, which were not observed in 2022?
Yes.
Quick one. At the beginning of your presentation, Thiago, you sort of mentioned, you know, how the sort of red spots, the kind of trouble bits were kind of spreading. And, you know, whilst it all appeared to be sort of going in the one direction, there were some exceptions to that, where, you know, the bad turned into good. So, you know, do you have any insight into those examples, which are clearly, you know, contrary to, you know, the larger sort of trend of things? And then the other sort of issue I just wanted to raise is that it seems to me that in PNG, with elections now, there is a really serious issue around, you know, do you go for security or compliance? You know, do you emphasize the importance of complying with electoral laws when we know that really nobody does? But we know that elections are becoming increasingly volatile, increasingly violent. And so the emphasis has to be on kind of secure elections, are relatively peaceful. How do you play one off against the other? And do you have to play one off against the other?
Thanks for the incredibly difficult questions. So the Yalibu Panja situation, it's interesting because Nicole observed there in 2022, and they were trying to do the right thing, but it was not working at all. Like they were trying to read the roll, but they just happened to have the wrong roll, so nobody voted. So we saw that kind of structural failure, but they were attempting to. And then in the LLG election, we saw like much more widespread things. This came as a surprise to some of the people that were interviewed, who said things to the effect of, I thank God and every one of us that we were able to achieve that. So it was clearly like a major achievement for that community. There were things in Yalibu that I found touching, like there was one of the interviewees who was just joking about a candidate who was like chasing all the voters into a swamp, into the duck pond, because he thought he had lost, and then it turned out that he had won. And I felt that for that to be a joke, something must be going well. But what is driving that, I think, is complex. There is the Yalibu have been working hard to achieve this at a community level. There is, I think, a different structural position of the MP there, who is perhaps more exposed to international scrutiny. But I'll be honest, I think it's something that we need to look at in greater detail. The second question, I don't think there will be security without compliance. Okay? If you try to run an election where there is a huge pot of gold, that's what happens when you have this kind of group voting, block vote, you've created a giant prize. Whoever controls that prize gets not just 1, 2, 20 ballots, they get the whole thing. That is too tempting, and it's going to cause frictions at some point. So you've got to figure out a way of unscrambling that, okay? Now, the question is, like, what is compliance, okay? And then there is compliance with the electoral rules. Let's do everything by the book. The electoral rules, nowhere in the world, specify everything that happens on polling day. Norms matter in every election. So when you ask about compliance, I would say that there is the question of how to get things broadly in line with something that is not wildly violent or uncontrollable, but also how do we get people participating in an election to create an inclusive environment? I feel I answered that quite well.
It's after 1:30, so I'm afraid we're going to have to...
There's one last question.
Oh, one last very quick question, sorry.
Thank you. Seeing that we're having 2027 elections, I'm mindful of the fact that in Tanzania last year, they held their elections. They had polling observers from multiple organizations. Over 1,000 people were dead. Hundreds are still missing. And this is despite multiple organizations observing their elections. A comment about local awareness. My understanding was that ward and LLG level should be supported with these new financial assistance, the 30,000, the I'm not sure if it's 250,000. I'm not sure, and I thought that the understanding from that was it was to dilute the DSIP and PSIP influence that would be happening, and I understand there's a lot of pushback from MPs on that. Yeah, that's all.
We might treat that as comment. I'll just finish off with a couple of quick comments, because I think it would be useful for you to be aware that, first of all, the reports have a huge range of variables, a huge range of factors examined. There's 149 figures and 54 tables in the 2022 election report. There's 59 figures in the LLG. So they're really worth looking at. Many of them are longitudinal. Violence in polling booths, boundary issues, roles issues, gender issues. So really deep, thoughtful work. Second thing is, as these people were saying yesterday when we met, there's now people, if you go back block voting to 1992, it's more than 30 years, 35 years next year, that some areas won't know that voting is what's involved, individual voting. So what are elections about if this is being allowed? A third thing is political economy. There's a pot of gold not just in the number of votes, but in being the governor. Then you control the provincial budget to a large extent, employment, contracting, the works program, district development authorities, the Open members control. And now, with money coming in at the local level and the ward level, there's new incentives. As Thiago's indicating, create small wards, create more LLGs. And then, what are the implications of this political economy for the prospects of reform? Because the beneficiaries of the system will not necessarily want to reform it. And what we've got is people trying to control different aspects of the electoral system to their own benefit, to give themselves the best chance of getting that pot of gold through the LLG, the DDA, or the provincial government. And the last thing is, just a more positive note, in this methodology, there's some real two-way capacity building going on. We might think, as a university, we're doing capacity building with organisations and helping the people that do the data collection, build their skills. But there's all this learning and capacity building coming back to us through the interaction. And this engagement between DPA and the organisation that Sarah and Margaret come from is a fantastic two-way process. So thank you to all four of them for a really fascinating discussion.